She walked into the law firm in flats and a cardigan, so they laughed at her. But when she said, "I'm the new partner," the room went silent. Sophie Matthews walked into Barrington and Hayes law firm with the same quiet confidence she carried every day. Dressed simply in a soft gray cardigan, a knee-length skirt, and flats, she stood out among the sea of tailored suits and sharp heels in the lobby. Her brown hair was tied back in a modest bun, her makeup minimal, as if her appearance could not have been less important. She simply carried herself as though she belonged. Take a second to subscribe. It really helps. Thanks. Now back to the story. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelly, glanced up from her desk, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She quickly masked it with a polite smile, but Sophie noticed. Kelly hesitated before responding, her voice just a little too dismissive. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Richard Barrington," Sophie replied smoothly. "I'm a new partner." Kelly's eyes widened, then quickly narrowed, a silent judgment flashing in her gaze. She scanned Sophie up and down, making an almost imperceptible snicker to herself. The look she gave Sophie said everything. No one like that could possibly be a partner at Barrington and Hayes. She was likely just in the wrong place. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake," Kelly said, her tone sharp, barely hiding her skepticism. "Are you sure you're in the right building?" Sophie didn't flinch. "Quite sure. I've been appointed. Richard's expecting me." A moment of awkward silence hung in the air before Kelly reluctantly stood up. She made a point of glancing at Sophie's attire once more, her mouth pursing in disapproval. "Please take a seat. I'll let him know you're here." As Sophie sat, the soft murmur of office chatter filled the space around her. Her eyes roamed over the polished wood furniture and gleaming marble floors. This was a world most people only dreamed of, and yet here she was walking through it as though she had every right. Sophie sat quietly in the waiting area, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't fidget, didn't glance around nervously. Instead, she observed the world around her, the polished, gleaming surfaces reflecting a world of luxury and prestige. It felt almost out of place with her modest clothing, but Sophie wasn't concerned with appearances. Across the room, two junior associates, Ryan and Olivia, were talking in hushed tones. Sophie could hear snippets of their conversation, their laughter more cutting than they realized. Ryan, with his sharp suit and expensive watch, eyed Sophie with an obvious sneer. "I swear, I've never seen anyone walk in here dressed like that," he whispered, his voice just loud enough for Sophie to hear. "Must be lost, right? I mean, what's she even doing here? This place is for serious clients." Olivia, her expression more curious than outright dismissive, joined in. "Probably a cleaning lady, or worse, an ex-mistress hoping for a payout." She chuckled, but the sound was hollow. Sophie didn't react. She could have stood up and confronted them, but she knew better. Instead, she focused on the slight tremor of her hands, the only sign of the tension that threatened to break her calm. She wasn't naive. She knew how people like them saw someone like her. But it wasn't about her. Not really. It was about them. Ryan continued, oblivious to how he was undermining himself. "I bet she thinks wearing a cardigan and some flats will make her fit in here. Look at that bag. It's probably fake." The sharpness of their words stung, but Sophie remained still, her eyes steady. She had faced this kind of disdain many times before. In law school, in her early career, she had never allowed it to shake her. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here because she belonged. Behind her, the elevator door slid open. Richard Barrington stepped out, a briefcase in hand, his face betraying a flicker of surprise as he noticed her. It was time. Richard Barrington approached Sophie with a measured expression, his hand extending toward her with the practiced ease of a man who had mastered the art of politeness. "Miss Matthews," he greeted her, his voice polite but laced with curiosity. "I must admit, I wasn't expecting you so soon. Please follow me." Sophie stood, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly as she met his gaze. She offered a small, confident smile and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Barrington." He led her down a corridor lined with impressive offices, the quiet hum of the law firm's daily business enveloping them. The air in the building felt cold, detached. Sophie had long learned not to expect warmth in places like this, and she had never needed it. What she needed now was respect, and that she would earn. Richard opened the door to his office, motioning for Sophie to take a seat. As she sat across from him, she noted his slight hesitation, the way he glanced at her modest attire before carefully masking his surprise. She wasn't the picture of an elite partner, and he didn't seem convinced she belonged here. "I was under the impression that the board hadn't yet finalized the appointments," Richard said, folding his hands in front of him, his eyes studying her with an unreadable expression. "Forgive me, but I'm not aware of your recent elevation to partner." Sophie's gaze held steady. "I understand your confusion, Mr. Barrington. I was appointed just last week. My credentials speak for themselves, and my work has already begun to speak louder than any resume could." She slid a folder across the desk, containing the official documents. Richard hesitated but then opened the folder. His eyes moved quickly over the paperwork, each word, each signature confirming her claim. His jaw tightened, and he glanced up, meeting her eyes for the first time with a new sense of understanding. "I see," he said quietly, the disbelief in his voice now tempered with a growing respect. "This is unexpected, but let's discuss how we can move forward then." Richard Barrington leaned back in his chair, still processing the surprising turn of events. Sophie sat across from him, her posture impeccable, her gaze steady, but he couldn't shake the doubts. He had seen many people rise through the ranks at Barrington and Hayes, but Sophie, someone who didn't fit the mold, seemed almost too out of place, too unlikely. "I must admit, I'm still trying to understand how this happened," Richard began, his voice carefully neutral. "The board typically likes to promote from within, and we've always had a certain standard for our partners." Sophie didn't flinch. She had heard similar words before, during her early career, when she was told she didn't look the part of a successful lawyer. She had learned long ago that being underestimated could be an advantage. "I assure you, Mr. Barrington," she said with quiet confidence, "the board made this decision because of my work, not my appearance. I've been at the firm for years, doing the work that others didn't want to. This promotion wasn't about fitting a mold. It was about the results I bring." Richard's brow furrowed slightly, still skeptical. "You're saying you've been here for years, and yet none of us have heard of you until now." Sophie nodded, undeterred. "Yes, I've been behind the scenes, handling cases that were too complex or unconventional for others to take on. I've built relationships with clients who trust me. But now I'm here to lead." Richard leaned forward, his hands pressed together. "I can't pretend this doesn't change things. The other partners, the associates, they won't be thrilled to have someone like you join the ranks, especially without the typical pedigree." Sophie met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not here to win a popularity contest, Mr. Barrington. I'm here to push this firm forward, and I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen." For a brief moment, Richard didn't respond. He simply studied her, the weight of his doubts shifting ever so slightly. Something about Sophie's calm confidence made him reconsider. Maybe she wasn't as unlikely as he had first thought. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her mind drifting for a moment as Richard silently reviewed the documents she had provided. She wasn't in any hurry to fill the silence. The weight of the moment was heavy with both anticipation and the sharp sting of skepticism she had faced for so long. Richard's doubt wasn't new. She had encountered it at every step of her journey. She thought back to her childhood, growing up in a small, modest home on the outskirts of a working-class neighborhood. Her parents had struggled to make ends meet, but they had instilled in her a sense of resilience and a belief that hard work was the true measure of success. Sophie had worked part-time jobs throughout high school and college, earning scholarships and fighting for every opportunity that came her way. Law school had been another battlefield. She had been surrounded by peers who were groomed for this path from birth, their families steeped in wealth and connections. Sophie had none of that. She was a first-generation student, determined to prove that her intelligence and drive were enough to make her stand out. Many of her classmates had seen her as an outsider, a girl from nowhere with nothing to offer. But she had worked harder than anyone, learning to speak their language of privilege while never forgetting where she came from. After graduation, she had started at a small firm, doing the kinds of cases no one else wanted, underdog cases, legal battles that felt too big for the clients they represented. The experience had shaped her, taught her the value of grit and the importance of a voice for those who had none. Sophie had earned her place in the legal world by demonstrating her worth with each case she won, each client she helped. Now, as she sat across from Richard Barrington, she knew her past had prepared her for this moment. She wasn't here by mistake. She had earned every inch of this new role, and she would prove it, no matter how many doubts remained in the room. Richard Barrington stared at Sophie across his desk, the tension palpable in the room. He had been in the business long enough to know that a partnership wasn't just about ability. It was about fitting into the firm's culture. And Sophie, in her simple attire and quiet confidence, seemed so out of place in the world of Barrington and Hayes. He couldn't reconcile her modest background with the image the firm had worked so hard to cultivate. "I need to be honest with you, Miss Matthews," Richard began, his tone more measured now. "There are some concerns among the senior partners. Your promotion has raised more than a few eyebrows. Not everyone believes you have the experience or the background to fit in with us." Sophie held his gaze steadily, not flinching. She had known this moment would come, just as she had known that getting to this point would never be easy. "I've been with the firm for years, Mr. Barrington," she replied calmly. "I've proven my skills, taken on difficult cases, and delivered results. I didn't get here by accident." Richard's brow furrowed. "That may be true, but it's one thing to win cases and another to lead this firm. This position requires a level of authority, of command. Can you really step into that role?" Sophie didn't hesitate. "I don't need to look the part to lead. I've never had the luxury of fitting in or conforming to others' expectations. I've built relationships with clients who trust me. I've earned their respect, and I intend to earn the respect of the partners here, too." Richard studied her, clearly wrestling with his doubts. "This isn't just about earning respect, Sophie. It's about handling the responsibilities that come with this position. The internal politics, the clients, the expectations. You'll be tested in ways you can't even anticipate." "I'm prepared for that," Sophie replied. "I've been tested before, and I've never backed down." The silence between them was thick, but Sophie's steady gaze never wavered. She wasn't just here to prove herself. She was here to change the game. Richard Barrington flipped through the papers Sophie had provided, his eyes scanning the official documents, the appointment letters, and the signatures from the board. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully process what he had been reluctant to believe. Sophie Matthews wasn't a mistake, a misplaced appointment, or some kind of clerical error. She was exactly who she said she was, the new partner at Barrington and Hayes. He looked up, meeting her calm, unflinching gaze. "I have to admit, Miss Matthews, I was wrong. The board has indeed confirmed your appointment. You're the new partner here." His voice was soft, his tone a mix of disbelief and begrudging respect. Sophie nodded, her expression unchanged, but inside, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. The battle for recognition had begun the moment she walked through the door, but now, in this room, she had finally been acknowledged. "I know this has come as a shock," she said, her voice steady. "I wasn't appointed because of any special connections or privileges. I've worked hard for this role, through years of cases, clients, and results that others couldn't deliver. I've been patient, quietly putting in the work to earn a place here." Richard leaned back in his chair, the realization settling in. "You've been with the firm for years, but you've been behind the scenes. Why didn't you push for this sooner?" Sophie's lips curled into a small smile. "I didn't need to. I knew that in time, my work would speak for itself. The firm needed someone who could lead, someone who wasn't bogged down by the politics or the superficial expectations. That's what I bring. Real results." There was a pause, and Richard allowed the weight of her words to settle between them. He had underestimated her, doubted her every step of the way. But now, as he looked at her, he saw someone who had earned her place, not just because of her skills, but because of her unwavering belief in what she could accomplish. The silence lingered a moment longer before he spoke again, his tone softer now. "I see. Welcome to the firm, Miss Matthews. The break room buzzed with the usual chatter, associates discussing cases, coworkers sipping coffee, and the faint hum of the vending machine. But today, the conversation was different. Sophie Matthews, the new partner, had become the talk of the office, and not in the way anyone would expect. Ryan and Olivia, standing by the coffee machine, exchanged glances before speaking in lowered voices, making sure their words were just loud enough for Sophie to overhear as she passed by. "Can you believe it?" Ryan said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "She's the new partner? I mean, look at her. I thought she was the cleaning staff when she first walked in." Olivia laughed, her voice sharp. "Right? The whole thing's absurd. She doesn't have the pedigree, the looks, or the connections. I don't get it. She's not even dressed properly. Those flats? They're more suited for the subway than for the boardroom." They both looked over at Sophie, who stood by the window, her back turned, making no indication she was aware of the whispers. She had been with the firm long enough to know how quickly news traveled, and how quickly judgment was passed. Ryan lowered his voice, leaning in toward Olivia. "I heard she didn't even want to take the lead on the biggest cases. She's been in the background all this time, doing the grunt work. It's a miracle she got picked for partner." Olivia shook her head. "I'm telling you, there's something off about all of this. She doesn't belong here. No one like her ever does." Sophie's eyes didn't leave the view outside the window, but inside, she could feel the weight of their words. She had heard it all before. She had faced these kinds of whispers throughout her career. People who thought they knew her, who felt threatened by her rise. Without a hint of emotion, she turned, walking back to her office. She didn't need to engage with their petty gossip. She had no time to prove herself to people who would never see her worth. The work would speak for itself, and in time they would understand. Sophie stepped into the conference room, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft click. The team of associates and senior partners were already gathered around the long mahogany table, the air thick with unspoken tension. Today was her first official day as partner, and she could feel the eyes of the room on her, some skeptical, others simply curious. No one spoke as she took her seat at the head of the table, the familiar silence hanging heavily. Richard Barrington was seated at the far end, his posture stiff. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Let's begin." The meeting was about to start, and Sophie could already tell that many in the room were sizing her up, measuring her worth, trying to figure out if she could handle the weight of the role. They all expected the usual display of power from a new partner, the flashy presentations, the grandiose speeches. But Sophie wasn't here to impress with words. She was here to prove herself with action. As the meeting progressed, Sophie sat back and listened, observing how each partner and associate interacted. She took careful note of the dynamics in the room, the subtle ways certain people tried to dominate the conversation, while others quietly deferred. It was clear that this was a space where power was asserted, not earned. Then, when the discussion shifted to a particularly tricky case, a corporate merger involving a major client, Sophie saw her opportunity. The team had been stuck on a legal loophole that was preventing them from moving forward. It was a technicality, but no one in the room had managed to find a solution. Sophie leaned forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "We need to reframe the problem," she said. "Instead of focusing on the legal hurdle, let's think about the bigger picture. What's at stake here is the client's long-term reputation, not just their financials." The room fell silent as everyone turned to her. Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Sophie outlined a solution, one that was bold, yet practical. As she spoke, she saw the nods of approval, the subtle shift in the room's energy. By the time the meeting ended, Sophie had made her mark, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, undeniable confidence that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. The following week, Sophie's resolve was tested sooner than she anticipated. A high-profile client, Gregory Hightower, a billionaire businessman known for his ruthlessness, had requested a last-minute meeting. His company was facing a major lawsuit, and he expected Barrington and Hayes to pull off a miracle. Richard Barrington made it clear that this was not just a business opportunity. It was a test of Sophie's leadership. Gregory Hightower was a key figure, one whose opinion could shape the future of the firm's reputation. Sophie prepared for the meeting with meticulous care, reviewing every document, every case precedent, and every strategy. She knew the stakes were high. Gregory was notorious for his disdain for anyone he saw as beneath him, and she had already felt the weight of the firm's doubt lingering in the air. When Gregory arrived at the firm, his presence seemed to fill the room, exuding an aura of authority that commanded attention. His sharp suit, perfectly polished shoes, and cold eyes marked him as a man who had always gotten what he wanted, and who expected the same now. The meeting began with pleasantries, but it quickly became clear that Gregory was not here for idle talk. "I don't care about your firm's reputation or its fancy credentials," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I care about results. I want this lawsuit handled, and I want to handle quickly. Money is no object, but I'll be watching closely. If you fail, it's on you." Sophie remained calm, her hands resting gently on the table. She had heard threats like this before, but there was something different about this moment. She wasn't just fighting for her reputation anymore. She was fighting for the integrity of the firm and for every person who had ever been underestimated. "Mr. Hightower," she said, her voice steady, "I understand the urgency, but our approach will be thorough, strategic, and in line with your best interests. We don't cut corners for a quick fix. We build long-term solutions. I'll handle this, and you'll see the results you want." The room went still. Gregory's gaze never left Sophie's face, but the sharp edge in his eyes softened just a fraction. "I'll hold you to that," he said. Sophie met his gaze, unshaken. "I welcome the challenge." 2 weeks later, Sophie's strategy was put to the test. The lawsuit that Gregory Hightower's company faced was a complex, multi-layered case involving a merger gone wrong, with allegations of fraud and breach of contract. Most firms would have handled it as just another high-profile case, but Sophie saw an opportunity to reshape the narrative. She had proposed a bold approach. Instead of focusing solely on defending Hightower, they would work proactively to rebuild his reputation in the eyes of both the public and the courts. The legal team had been skeptical. They were used to aggressive tactics, threatening lawsuits, discrediting opponents, and playing the game by the book. Sophie, however, had suggested leveraging Hightower's past successes, his charitable contributions, and his vision for future growth to create a positive story that resonated with the public. It was risky, but it was also brilliant. It was the kind of thinking that set her apart. When the final day of the trial came, Sophie presented her case with confidence. She didn't just rely on legal jargon. She spoke directly to the jurors, appealing to their sense of fairness, to the broader implications of the case. Her argument wasn't just about winning. It was about ensuring that the right thing was done. And slowly, as she spoke, the room began to shift. Even the opposing counsel seemed taken aback by her approach. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came in. The case was dismissed. Hightower was exonerated, and the media hailed him as a businessman who had turned a new leaf, one that could be trusted again. When Sophie walked out of the courtroom, Richard Barrington was waiting for her. His face was unreadable for a moment, and then, finally, he spoke. "You did it." Sophie offered a small but knowing smile. "We did it," she corrected, knowing that this victory wasn't just hers. It was a victory for the entire firm, one that would start to change the way people viewed her and Barrington and Hayes. The first step had been taken, and it had been a resounding success. The office had been buzzing with praise for Sophie's success in the Hightower case, but the real test was still to come. It came unexpectedly during the firm's annual gala. It was a night of celebration, where the firm's highest earners mingled with clients, old friends, and industry influencers. Everyone was dressed to impress, in extravagant gowns and sharp tuxedos. Sophie, always more comfortable in simple, modest attire, had chosen a sleek black dress that reached just below her knees, paired with a subtle necklace and simple heels. She wasn't trying to stand out. She never had. But tonight, her modesty felt like a glaring contrast to the opulence around her. As she entered the grand ballroom, the murmur of conversation seemed to pause for just a moment. Sophie felt eyes on her, and she immediately wished she could disappear into the crowd. The people here were used to seeing their peers dressed in designer clothes, exuding wealth and influence. Sophie didn't belong to their world, and they didn't hide their judgment. She approached the bar, hoping to blend into the background. As she ordered a glass of wine, she overheard a group of associates at a nearby table whispering, their words intentionally loud. "Is that Sophie Matthews?" one of them asked, her voice dripping with incredulity. "I thought she'd at least try to dress the part of a partner." "I don't get it," another one replied. "She's done well with a Hightower case, but does she really think this is enough? A simple dress like that? No diamonds, no designer purse? It's embarrassing." Sophie's face flushed with a quiet humiliation, but she didn't respond. She could feel the weight of their words sinking in, but she refused to let it show. She took her glass of wine, nodded politely to the bartender, and walked away. She spent the rest of the evening in relative solitude, avoiding the crowded groups, her presence unnoticed by most. The praise she had earned in the boardroom meant nothing to the people who mattered here. As she looked around at the glittering guests, Sophie felt more out of place than ever. But she wouldn't let their judgments define her. She wasn't here for them. She was here to lead. The gala had passed, and Sophie felt the sting of isolation linger long after she left the glittering hall. The whispers, the looks, they were harder to shake than she had anticipated. Despite her success, despite the victory she had achieved for the firm, the silent judgment had worn away at her resolve. It wasn't just the gala, it was the constant undercurrent of doubt from those who felt she didn't belong. But the turning point came a week later, in the form of an unexpected meeting. Sophie had just finished a long day of case reviews when Richard Barrington called her into his office. His tone was different this time, less guarded, more honest. "Sophie, I need to speak with you," he said, motioning for her to sit. She sat down, bracing herself for another round of doubt or disappointment. Richard leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I've been hearing things, and I want to be upfront with you." Sophie raised an eyebrow, already suspecting what was coming. "What kind of things?" "Rumors. About you. The associates are concerned. They're questioning whether you're truly ready for this role. There's talk about your approach to leadership, whether you're tough enough, whether you can handle the pressure long term. Some are even calling it a fluke." The words stung, but Sophie forced herself to remain calm. "I've heard the whispers. I'm used to them." Richard's expression softened. "I know you are, but it's different now. This firm is built on more than just legal acumen. It's built on perception, on influence. You've done well, but you need to prove you can lead in ways beyond just winning cases. You need to show them you belong." Sophie sat silently for a moment, absorbing his words. Then, with quiet determination, she spoke. "I understand. I've always known the battle wasn't just about the law. It's about making people see me for who I really am." Richard nodded slowly. "I believe you're capable, but you need to take charge of the narrative. You need to show them that you define what leadership looks like here." Sophie left his office that day with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about winning cases anymore. It was about rewriting the rules on her own terms. And she was ready. The following weeks were a battle of wills. Sophie's approach to leadership was met with subtle but persistent resistance from some of the firm's senior partners, and none more so than Ryan and Olivia. They had been among the most vocal skeptics since her appointment, and now that she was starting to gain traction, they seemed determined to remind everyone just how much they didn't think she belonged. It began with small things, little comments in meetings, sidelong glances, and passive-aggressive remarks designed to undermine her authority. At first, Sophie ignored them, focusing on the work at hand. But it was becoming harder to ignore the quiet campaign being waged against her. One afternoon, during a critical client pitch, Ryan spoke up in the middle of Sophie's presentation. His tone was condescending, and his words veiled in sarcasm. "That's a bold suggestion, Sophie," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I'm not sure our client would be on board with such an unconventional approach. Perhaps we should stick to the safe route." The room fell silent for a beat, and Sophie's gaze met his. She didn't flinch, didn't let the challenge throw her off. "Ryan, the safe route is why we're stuck in the past," she said calmly. "Our client is looking for innovation, and we're here to provide it." Ryan's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, casting a glance at the other partners in the room. He knew he couldn't take the easy way out in front of everyone, but it was clear he wasn't done. Olivia, standing quietly by, exchanged a knowing look with him. Sophie could feel the weight of their rivalry, like a constant undercurrent that threatened to pull her under. Later that evening, Richard Barrington called Sophie into his office again. "I saw what happened in the meeting," he said, his voice more measured than usual. "You handled yourself well, but you need to be aware of the growing tension. Ryan and Olivia aren't backing down." Sophie nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm not going anywhere." Richard studied her for a moment. "Good, because they're not the only ones testing you." Sophie left his office that night, feeling the weight of the firm's challenges pressing in, but she wasn't backing down. It was time to turn their resistance into something they couldn't ignore. Sophie had known from the start that the path to leadership at Barrington and Hayes wouldn't be easy. What she hadn't anticipated was how relentless the pushback would be, how the whispers and subtle jabs would become part of her daily life. But as the weeks passed, something inside her shifted. The resistance from Ryan, Olivia, and the others began to feel less like an obstacle and more like a challenge she was ready to meet head-on. The firm's biggest case of the year was on the horizon, an acquisition deal between two global giants, and Sophie was tapped to lead the strategy. It was a case that would make or break her tenure as partner, and the pressure was mounting. Ryan and Olivia, sensing the stakes, doubled down on their attempts to undermine her. They questioned her approach in meetings, second-guessed her decisions, and criticized her in private. But Sophie had learned to ignore the distractions. One afternoon, during a high-stakes meeting with the client, things came to a head. Ryan once again challenged Sophie's strategy, his voice laced with condescension. "I think we're overcomplicating this, Sophie. We need a simpler solution, something straightforward that doesn't involve so much risk," he said, his eyes scanning the room, waiting for support. Sophie remained calm. She had done her homework, and she knew that the riskier approach was the right one. "The safe route isn't going to get us what the client needs," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "We're not here to play it safe. We're here to solve their biggest challenges." The room fell silent. For a moment, there was a pause. Then, to her surprise, a few of the senior partners nodded in agreement. Richard Barrington, who had been watching the exchange closely, gave a slight, approving smile. Ryan and Olivia exchanged glances but said nothing further. After the meeting, Sophie felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had faced their challenges, risen above the petty games, and held her ground. The victory wasn't in the win itself, but in the way she had maintained her dignity, her focus, and her resolve. She wasn't just proving herself to them. She was proving to herself that she belonged here. The next few weeks brought a new level of tension to Sophie's world. The acquisition case, which had seemed like the firm's most promising opportunity, began to unravel. New information surfaced suggesting that one of the companies involved had been involved in questionable financial practices. Sophie was the lead partner overseeing the deal, and the pressure to close, it was immense. The higher-ups wanted results, and quickly, but the whispers from behind the scenes grew louder. One afternoon, during a meeting with the client, a senior associate named Greg approached Sophie with troubling news. He had uncovered discrepancies in the financial reports, indicating that one of the key players in the deal had been inflating their assets. The truth was ugly, and it wasn't something Sophie could ignore. But to bring it to light would risk jeopardizing the entire deal, and by extension, her reputation and the firm's standing in the industry. Greg, seeing the hesitation in her eyes, pushed. "We can't ignore this, Sophie. We have a duty to our clients, to the truth. If we don't act now, it'll come back to haunt us." Sophie's fingers tightened around the edges of her papers. She understood the gravity of the situation. If she revealed the information now, it could lead to a complete collapse of the deal. But if she kept quiet, it would compromise the firm's integrity and her own. She spent the evening contemplating the decision. The stakes were higher than ever. Closing the deal meant significant financial gains for the firm, but letting the corruption slide would haunt her for the rest of her career. Sophie had always believed that integrity was everything. She wasn't about to compromise it for short-term success. The next morning, She called an emergency meeting with Richard Barrington and the senior partners. As they sat around the table, Sophie laid out the evidence. I can't, in good conscience, move forward with this deal. The truth is, we've uncovered fraudulent activity that we need to address immediately, she said, her voice unwavering. Richard's gaze was sharp, studying her. The room grew tense, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. But Sophie had made her choice. She was going to stand by her integrity, no matter the consequences. The following days felt heavier than Sophie had anticipated. The fallout from the decision to expose the fraud in the acquisition deal was swift and intense. The firm's leadership team was divided, and some of the partners were furious. They had seen the deal as a golden opportunity, one that could propel Barrington and Hayes into new heights. Instead, Sophie's decision to halt the deal over ethical concerns had caused a rift, one that threatened to undermine her standing within the firm. Richard Barrington had been silent for days, his face unreadable during their meetings. The others, including Ryan and Olivia, had made no secret of their displeasure. Sophie had expected this kind of resistance. She knew the price of doing the right thing often came at a cost. But there was something deeper at play, something she hadn't anticipated. The firm wasn't just questioning her decision. They were questioning her as if her integrity had somehow been an attack on everything they valued. It all came to a head when Sophie received an unexpected visitor. It was late one evening when she found Richard waiting for her outside her office. He was alone, his expression stern, but there was something else, something more human, behind his eyes. Sophie, he began, his voice low. I need to talk to you about something. She looked up, surprised, but motioned for him to enter. They sat across from each other, the silence thick between them. You made a tough call last week, Richard continued. One I didn't expect, and one that's had consequences I hadn't foreseen. But there's more to this, isn't there? Sophie's heart skipped. She could feel the weight of her past creeping into the room, like an old, familiar shadow. What do you mean? I know you've worked harder than anyone to earn your place here, Richard said, his voice softening. But there's something I haven't been telling you. I've seen your growth, your work, and your potential, but I've also seen you hold back. I've seen you fight against a past you've never let go of. Sophie looked at him, her eyes narrowing, and for the first time in years, the past she had worked so hard to bury came rushing to the surface. Sophie sat in her office late into the night, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The conversation with Richard had unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. His words echoed in her mind. I've seen you hold back. It wasn't just about the firm or the work she had done. It was about the part of herself she had kept hidden, the part that feared judgment, that was always on the defensive, always second-guessing. She had spent so much of her life proving her worth to others, to those who doubted her, to those who thought she didn't belong. But now, as she thought about Richard's words, Sophie realized it wasn't just about proving herself anymore. She had to let go of the weight of her past, the constant need to show she was worthy. The firm needed her to lead with the same integrity she had always stood by, but they also needed to trust her fully. The next morning, she made a decision. She would begin to build the trust that had been so lacking, not just with her colleagues, but with herself. She wasn't going to shy away from her past anymore. Instead, she would use it to shape the future of Barrington and Hayes. Her experiences, both the triumphs and the struggles, had made her the leader she was today. It was time to embrace that fully, to stop hiding behind the facade of being just the quiet, modest attorney and step into the role she had earned. At the next firm-wide meeting, Sophie spoke up with an uncharacteristic confidence. We've been at a crossroads, she began, her voice calm but firm. We've built a reputation on winning cases, on financial success. But that isn't enough. If we're going to continue to grow, we need to trust each other. We need to trust our judgment, our values, and most importantly, we need to trust that doing the right thing will always be our top priority. The room was silent at first, the partners and associates exchanging uncertain glances. But then, to Sophie's surprise, one by one, they nodded. It wasn't a loud applause or an immediate wave of support. It was something quieter, more profound, the first signs of trust beginning to take root. And for Sophie, that was enough. The weeks that followed were a constant balancing act for Sophie. As she began to settle into her role as a leader, her every decision was scrutinized more closely than ever before. There was no room for error. She had managed to win over some of the partners with her straightforward approach and unwavering ethics. But there were still those who held on to their doubts. And, as it turned out, the most significant test of her leadership was yet to come. One afternoon, the firm was approached by a high-profile client, Marcus Calloway, a tech mogul with a reputation for playing the game of business ruthlessly. Calloway's company was under investigation for a series of questionable patents, and he needed Barrington and Hayes to secure a lucrative acquisition deal with one of the world's largest investors. The stakes were astronomical: millions of dollars, potential industry domination, and a deal that could significantly elevate the firm's prestige. But there was a catch. Sophie quickly learned that the entire deal hinged on suppressing key pieces of evidence that could potentially implicate Calloway in fraudulent activities. It was a morally gray area, a dilemma she had hoped she would never face. The firm's partners were already leaning toward taking the deal, pushing Sophie to do the same. They reminded her that this kind of high-profile acquisition was exactly what Barrington and Hayes needed to secure their position in the market. The temptation to say yes, to let the firm grow and thrive, was palpable. But Sophie knew better. She had spent years building a reputation based on doing what was right, not what was easy. The evidence was clear, and suppressing it would put the firm's integrity, and her own, at risk. The pressure mounted as the hours ticked down. Sophie stood at the crossroads, her decision not just a professional one, but a personal one. She had to decide whether she was going to compromise her values for success or whether she was willing to risk everything for what she believed in. She made the call. "I'm not moving forward with the deal," she said, her voice steady but resolute. "We can't ignore the truth. Not for money, not for anything." Sophie's decision to reject the Calloway deal rippled through the firm, and not in the way she had hoped. The senior partners, still reeling from the missed opportunity, were openly frustrated. They had been counting on that acquisition to push the firm into new territories, and Sophie's stance had placed them at odds with the very thing they had built the firm around: success by any means necessary. Richard Barrington was particularly uneasy, his disappointment hanging heavy in the air. "Sophie, you've got to understand the bigger picture here. This was a chance to change everything for us. We could have leveraged this deal into something far greater. Now, we're stuck scrambling for new prospects." Sophie stood firm, her gaze unwavering. "The firm is built on reputation and integrity, Richard. If we abandon that now, we won't just lose the deal, we'll lose everything that matters." Richard sighed deeply, his hands clasped in front of him as though trying to summon a solution. "I know you believe that, Sophie, but we need a way forward. Something bold. Otherwise, we risk losing credibility in the industry, and that could be the end of us." The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Sophie knew Richard was right about one thing. If Barrington and Hayes didn't adapt, they would be left behind. But compromising wasn't the solution. The question remained: how could they move forward without losing themselves? Sophie took a deep breath, the idea forming slowly in her mind. She needed to find a path that upheld the firm's values and still pushed them toward success. "I have a proposal," she said, her voice steady. "We shift our focus. Instead of chasing high-risk, high-reward acquisitions, we look at partnerships with companies that prioritize innovation and ethical practices, companies that we can help grow without compromising our integrity." Richard's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "A different approach, then? More selective, more ethical?" "Exactly," Sophie replied, a spark of conviction in her eyes. "We become leaders in responsible business. We don't need to chase the big fish. We need to build a reputation for standing by the right clients, no matter their size. This will be the kind of work that defines us, not just for what we win, but for how we win it." The room went quiet for a moment before Richard spoke, his tone thoughtful. "You might be onto something, Sophie. Let's explore this." Sophie's proposal had set a new course for Barrington and Hayes, but not everyone was on board. The firm's senior partners, many of whom had been with the company for decades, weren't exactly thrilled by the idea of abandoning their traditional approach. They had built their success on big-money deals and high-profile clients, and Sophie's vision of selective, ethical partnerships felt like a radical departure from everything they knew. Ryan, as expected, was the most vocal in his opposition. He'd been with the firm for almost 15 years and had earned his position by playing the game according to the rules of power and profit. To him, Sophie's new direction was naive, an unnecessary risk that could put everything they had worked for in jeopardy. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing, Sophie," Ryan said one afternoon, his tone sharp. "But chasing after ethical clients is going to put us in a position where we're not even competing with the big leagues. We've been successful because we know how to get things done, no matter what." Sophie met his gaze, her expression calm. "You're right, Ryan. We've been successful. But what kind of success are we building? The kind that's based on exploiting the system, or the kind that stands for something more? We can't keep going down this road and pretend it won't catch up with us." Ryan scoffed, but Sophie's voice remained unwavering. "I'm not asking anyone to abandon what they've worked for. I'm asking us to evolve, to build something that lasts, not just for a few high-stakes deals, but for a legacy." The room was silent, and Sophie could feel the weight of their skepticism. But she wasn't backing down. She wasn't asking them to change overnight, but she had to push for this new direction. And she had the one thing they didn't: vision. "I'm prepared to lead us through this transition," Sophie said. "But I need you to trust me." There was a long pause, and then Richard Barrington finally spoke up. "Let's see where this takes us," he said quietly, signaling that he was willing to give Sophie's approach a chance. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step forward, a crack in the old guard's resistance. The tension that had been building within the firm reached its breaking point during a board meeting that was scheduled to finalize the direction of Barrington and Hayes. The senior partners, still reluctant to embrace Sophie's vision, had pushed back every step of the way. But now, it was clear that the firm's future depended on the decisions they made in that room. This meeting would determine whether Sophie's plan for ethical, sustainable growth would be realized, or whether the firm would continue down the path of high-risk, high-reward deals that had been their bread and butter for years. As the meeting began, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken judgment. Ryan was there, as was Olivia, their faces a mix of frustration and suspicion. Richard Barrington sat at the head of the table, his expression guarded, but there was an unmistakable weariness in his eyes. He had seen both sides of the argument, and now he had to choose where his loyalty lay. Sophie was ready. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, knowing that this was her final chance to prove her point. The room fell silent as she stood, her calm demeanor betraying none of the nerve she had felt in the past. "We've discussed this for weeks," Sophie began, her voice steady. "And now it's time to make a decision. We can continue down the path of traditional high-stakes deals, focusing solely on the money, or we can forge a new future, one where our clients value us for more than just what we can deliver in a contract. We can build a legacy that aligns with our values. A legacy we can be proud of." Ryan sneered, leaning forward. "And you think this new direction is going to keep us competitive? You're dreaming, Sophie. The big players don't care about values. They care about results." Sophie met his gaze without flinching. "And that's the problem, Ryan. We've spent too long catering to clients who only care about the short-term win. We're better than that." The room was still, every eye locked on Sophie. Then Richard spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "I think it's time we start believing in something bigger than just the next deal." The final confrontation had ended, and for the first time, the firm felt like it might be ready to change. The days following the board meeting were filled with tension, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The firm had chosen to follow Sophie's vision, but it wasn't an easy transition. The old guard still held power, and their resistance to change was not easily overcome. Ryan and Olivia, though quiet for now, were still skeptical, waiting for the inevitable moment when Sophie's ideas would falter. But Sophie wasn't faltering. She had known from the beginning that the road would be long and difficult. She had earned her place as a partner, and now it was time to prove that her leadership could reshape the firm without compromising its integrity. The first major test came when Sophie brought a new client to the table, a nonprofit organization focused on sustainable development in emerging markets. The client's needs were complex, their approach unconventional, and the stakes were high. Some of the senior partners were already questioning whether they should even entertain the idea. The potential revenue wasn't as significant as other deals they had pursued, and the project's ethical focus seemed too far removed from the firm's usual interests. Richard Barrington, still watching from the sidelines, gave Sophie the space to make her pitch. She stood confidently in front of the group, laying out the potential for long-term partnership and the firm's ability to help create change in a sector that needed it most. The room was quiet as she spoke, her words resonating with a passion that had been absent from the firm's meetings for years. When she finished, there was a pause. Then, to her surprise, one of the senior partners, Charles, who had been openly critical of her in the past, spoke up. "This is the kind of work we should be doing," he said, his voice steady but with a note of conviction. "I see the bigger picture now." One by one, the others began to nod in agreement. Even Ryan, who had remained silent, seemed to be reconsidering his stance. By the end of the meeting, the firm had made its decision. They would take on the project. Sophie had won them over, not through force, but through vision, persistence, and the undeniable value of her approach. The firm was changing, and for the first time, Sophie felt the weight of their trust fully in her hands. The weeks following the approval of the nonprofit project were transformative for Sophie. What had once felt like an uphill battle against the ingrained traditions of Barrington and Hayes was now starting to feel like a movement. She had proven that her ethical approach, her focus on long-term, meaningful partnerships, could not only succeed, but elevate the firm in ways that were previously unimaginable. Sophie's calendar was filled with back-to-back meetings, many of them with clients who had been watching Barrington and Hayes from the sidelines, waiting to see if they would adapt to the changing world of business. The firm's reputation was beginning to shift, slowly but surely. The steady stream of high-value, ethical clients she had brought in proved that the firm didn't need to compromise its values to be successful. One afternoon, as she wrapped up a meeting with an international client looking to expand into new markets, Richard Barrington called her into his office. The atmosphere between them had changed in recent weeks. There was a respect there now, something that hadn't been present before. "Sophie, I've been watching everything you've been doing," Richard said, his tone more genuine than it had ever been. "The work you're bringing in, the way you've managed to turn the tide in this firm. I couldn't be more impressed." Sophie nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "It's been a team effort. I'm not doing this alone." Richard smiled, his eyes softening.